rise to the pledge, please. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I'll be the stand-in for certain lines of it.
So if I could have a motion to accept tonight's agenda.
So moved.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. So we'll now move down to 6.1. Dr. Harrison?
Yeah, so good evening. As the board will recall, we've had an extensive process to consider the revision of our student dress code. That process grew out of some conversation here at a board meeting, and then beginning of this school year, we put out a draft of a revised dress code that had been considered by the administration and the Board of Education to the community for feedback. That survey received 291 responses. That data then was brought forth through a representative committee of our school district that was inclusive of our high school students, Board of Ed trustees, teachers, and administrators. That committee then made some recommendations for a few more edits to the proposed code that came forward and I shared with the board at the last meeting. And then, as you will recall, the board made a few additional revisions, which are reflected in a revised dress code that has been integrated into the student code of conduct. It would be my recommendation that the board re-adopt the code of conduct that would be inclusive of the revised dress code this evening. Assuming that you do, I'm prepared to send out a communication to the entire school community, and with a separate communication that will go to our secondary, directly to our secondary students tomorrow, and that the dress code, the new code, would go into full effect immediately. That said, certainly there's an opportunity for the board to have additional conversation in consideration of that recommendation.
I'm too busy chewing.
Okay.
If so, ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I appreciate that as we had discussed, and it looks like we're planning to do, that we'll have a conversation about any potential resources or guidance that we could help to inform the dress code going forward. So I appreciate that we have that opportunity. I have a second bit I'd like to say about the overall dress code, but if anybody wants to speak to, not to the code of conduct, if anybody wants to speak to the dress code first, defer to them.
I think the thing with the dress code, I think at the last meeting, a few of us, including myself, did discuss our feelings about how there are some issues about how much is allowed, and I think, I just want to see from my colleagues if we agree that we decided that with all the committee work that was done and the amount of outreach that was done, that there's a level of comfort with this, and that would include those of us who are going to work to provide some more guidance as possible over the next few months.
Well, I think the key is keeping it to be as living a document as you can, really, in terms of, I mean, the reason this was changed, I mean, I remember you said, even Dr. Harrison, right, that this is something that wasn't revised for a while, and it reflected old language, and someone, I think, not becoming necessarily a living, breathing document, like curriculum or anything like that, but something that does get looked at and attended to in terms of the times.
And I think you told it right, and the code of conduct comes up every year, so we can revisit it on a yearly basis.
I think this is a good update in terms of bringing the dress code forward. I think respecting the work that the committee did, to bring this forward, as well as the community engagement. I'm comfortable with the code now as revised, and to the extent we publish some additional guidance, and it would be just that guidance. If we're able to do that, I know we have a subcommittee of the board that's going to be working on that, but at this point, at least from where I sit, I'm good with moving forward.
Thank you.
And I believe that we've already set a date for a meeting with that subcommittee of the board to for that further guidance, so to speak. And so that is scheduled for in January. And I would say certainly as an extension of that, when we had some of our initial conversations on this subject, there was dialogue with respect to looking to review and revisit the broader code. And I don't know, Michael, if that's the path.
That's
you
what
wanna go.
I'm referring to, exactly.
Yeah. So I had committed back when we initially had this conversation early this school year, that this spring that we would have an inclusive process similar to the dress code to have dialogue with respect to the entire code of conduct and consider revisions. I know some of the dialogue that had come up in interest from trustees was focused in and around philosophy and approach to discipline. So I think there would be opportunities for shifts in language to reflect our evolving beliefs and practices in the school district, as well as some of that other general review that we did with the dress code that would allow us to make other adjustments as we see appropriate.
But I think this may be a good place for the policy committee in the first instance to take a look at the overall code of conduct and see if there are additional changes that we may want to make. And I think the goal is to try to move our process up a little bit so that it's not left to the summer where we're reviewing and approving it, such that there'll be then time for policy committee in the spring to take a look at it, bring any suggestions for changes forward to the board, similar to kind of a first read type approach. That way we can have a further dialogue around potential changes that we may want to make to language in the overall code, with the idea of having a final code in place by the end of the school year, so that way it's ready to hit the ground running for the beginning of then the new school year.
And I appreciate all that process. I've now been on the board a certain number of years, and we haven't really tackled the code of conduct during that period. And as Dr. Harrison referenced, it was a good long time since really there'd been a major review of it. So while we have the opportunity to vote on it every year, clearly with between having a stakeholder process of policy committee, bringing it to the board, revising, it's a lot of work. So it's not easily done, but hopefully. So I don't expect something that we're going to tweak every year necessarily, but I hope we recognize that we come back to it periodically. Yeah. So I appreciate that.
Okay. Anyone have anything further on the dress code before we move on to Carol's presentation?
But just a final thought, which is that I think it's important enough that I had planned to ask us to vote separately on this outside the consent agenda, but the questions I had have been addressed, so I'm comfortable leaving it in the consent agenda.
Okay.
Thank you.
Super.
Carol, over to you.
So to introduce, that said, last year, I would say it was the same meeting as this, maybe a day later. I think it was maybe December 18th last year. We kind of took a bit of a shift in some of our practice, and we looked to answer two different questions, and both were items that were growing out of conversation that had happened in board meetings over the years, as well as outgrowth from our strategic plan. And that was looking at long-range planning. And we did so in two components last year. Last year, there was particular question related to faculty and staff, and trying to get a sense of, where do we see ourselves potentially going, and looking at what is that, and Mr. Hanna, if I may steal a phrase that you use, what does full employment look like for Irvington schools as far as we could see it today? So last year, we linked our strategic objectives to needs that we foresaw over the coming years. And as you will see, if you were to look back from our budget process last year, you would see that we addressed some of those concerns, or sought to address some of them. And this year's budget process, we will draw upon those recommendations. The second part of that presentation was a bit of a look into our district's finances, and Carol, using her expert financial mind to run a series of scenarios to begin to look at financial projections for the coming years. So while we saw that as value last year, we also believe it's important to update that on a regular basis. So tonight, we're going to take a few minutes to kind of walk through the connections that lead to this financial plan on a long-range context. And then Carol will discuss some of the thoughts that she has and the projections that she's able to make. So as I said, all this work grows out of our strategic plan, which certainly underpins all the work that we do across the district. And there before you are our strategic objectives that we focus on each and every year. And then notably, we draw attention to objective number 6, where we ensure the fiscal health of the district and provide for high-quality learning environment. And a key action that sits within that is the development, which was last year, and the maintenance, which is this year and all the years moving forward, of a long-range financial plan. That said, just a reminder and a refresher, an overview of our district goal structure. You're familiar with this because these are goals that are embedded in everything that we do across the district. And you've seen these goals develop and evolve over recent years. And the focus area number 3 is where we are really spending our time and energy this evening. And that first objective being business and operation initiatives shall support the strategic plan in the district's finances and operations. So we've set goals for this evening, and that is taking a look at where we are and understanding that a long-range plan is a guide, and that, as indicated on the screen, that we do not have a crystal ball, that we're making some projections here, and have to make a number of assumptions to inform those projections. And we know it's difficult business being a public entity to know that our funding can shift from year to year based upon global conditions. And some of those things that go well beyond just thinking about our ability to raise revenue for our total for our local tax levy is thinking about other drivers. So pension, we know pension shifts from year to year. The board and administration took a responsible step by looking to develop a TRS reserve last year that'll be able to help us manage that in future years. Health insurance premiums, which will shift from year to year depending on our consortium's experience rating, utility costs, and other transportation expenses, in addition to obvious salary increases each year.
Okay, so that brings us to the next slide. So the overview of the long-range financial plan. So as Chris mentioned, it's a useful tool. I would say that it is really only a tool, and we can't take this as definitive, this is what's going to happen in the next 5 years. I don't have that good a crystal ball, and too much change happens. But when you do this, you look at some of the past information. Does that really help you? Some places it does a little bit, some places it doesn't. I would say more often than not it doesn't, because you're looking at the future, you're looking at more of the recent data, and you're also looking at what you expect to happen going forward. There are some places where, definitely I take a look at that and try to make a sense. Have we been growing on a certain percentage basis and use that as a guide? But, with the key drivers, it's really not that useful. I don't know, if I could take the average of health insurance over the years, that might be great, but then, our plan might say we're going to go up 10%. We've had some years where we went down, not down, but like much lower on a percentage increase. So those are the things. Special ed placements is another example. Students move around. Some years there's more out-of-district placements. Some years we're able to accommodate more in-district. Things happen. Sometimes children move in, sometimes children move out. So all those things, those are hard to look at the past and say that's going to predict the future. But we still look at it, and I have some of that as my guide. Some of the information we know, going forward. I know my debt schedule. That's an easy one. I did make an assumption for the new borrowing that we're going to have, pretty much replace what was coming off, which is what we committed to the community. So to make that tax neutral, so I put that same number in. how to estimate the interest somewhat, but there's a plan in there. And we have settled contracts for the most part. We are going into the CSEA clerical and aid contract, so that is one place going forward. I don't have it, but we made some assumptions there. So the other ones are all key assumptions, and the biggest one, and we'll talk about that mostly tonight, is the tax cap, because when I get into the next piece of it, obviously your revenue drives your expenditures. That's the new world we've been in the last 6-7 years now, or more, actually more, almost 10 years now. So where it used to be you just kind of made your own budget, you made your expenditures, and then you say, oh, let's raise the revenue for it. That's not the world anymore. So the world now is that the revenue has to drive the expenditures. So those are the things, and I'll go through each of the assumptions that we've made. The idea when you make the plan is to have a conservative plan, but somewhat realistic. So if you're too conservative, you're going to be too pessimistic, and you won't be able to make any type of plans for the future. So that's really not great. You want to think, where are my opportunities going to land in terms of what we could do if we want to make some strategic changes, which is your role, right? So I'm trying to get a sense for where might that happen. But I also have to be conservative to say, well, we don't want to add like 10 people and then find out in 2 years we couldn't really have afforded that. So those are the kinds of things that a long-range plan can help you achieve. We project a push-ahead budget for the most part, meaning that I'm not adding any new staff when I do this. So we're keeping all the same staff going forward in this plan. So that's something that where you start with a plan, and then that's where you can also see maybe some opportunities to do that. So I'll talk about that in terms of strategies afterwards. So what are some of the assumptions that I've used? Similar to last year, I put this same chart up, and this is kind of like where I start with my assumptions as I go through it. So starting for 2021, we already know our tax cap growth factor, which is 1.88. That's a fairly healthy number. It could be as low as 1, which is just neutral. I've seen some neighboring districts over 2. Anything between that 1.5 and 2, is a good, fairly healthy number for us. But then again, I didn't really assume much more going forward, because it's one of those things that you don't know it. It's set by the Office of Real Property Tax. It's not based on assessments going up. It's based on property growth, like new buildings, new houses going up. I've seen some things as I drive through the neighborhood, but how many more of those are coming, and when do they come online, and how long that takes is the piece of it. I'm not really sure of the formula of how they arrive at that, but it's one of those numbers where, I just try to call and get the number and hope for the best. And there's no way to know the future on that. I've called and asked them, how do I look at the future on that? And we don't know. So it's not one I can really predict. So I just was more conservative there on that one. The tax pack, the CPI, I used 1.5 in this particular model scenario. So I believe it's going to be around 1.5 right now for 2021. We're landing right there on the average for the year as of now with 2 months to go. We still have November and December to report in, but through October it's about 1.5. So I'm hoping we stay there. There's a potential for it to go up a little bit more, or potential for it to go to 1.4, so that's where I'm looking right now. And so I did that all the way throughout the years. I will show another scenario later where I take that down so you can see what the effect of that would be. State aid, I just used a 1.5% increase, because generally that falls along the same lines as the CPI factor. They tend to go up in a fairly similar manner. BOCES aid, I did increase it a little bit higher. We've been seeing a trend, and this is where I am using my past experience. So the BOCES aid we've been seeing going a little bit higher. We've been spending more on BOCES products in an attempt to save money in shared services and get the aid. So I've been bringing that one up. And then you'll see where I talk about the appropriated fund balance. I started with the 422.5, and I'm going to talk about that in the next couple slides. The TRS pension match, this year we're going to be at 8.86, but next year we'll be at 10.25. It's the range they've set is between around 10 or to 10.25. That's what they've given us as a preliminary number. They may end up going down a slight amount, but then I just went up to 10.5 and beyond. That really is subject mostly to the revenue that the fund earns and the market rates. So believe it or not, that's 85% of their revenue is coming from market revenue. And then they look at kind of a 5-year average of what those market revenues are. The ERS rate, they've been holding that fairly steady, but I've actually seen a decrease for us because of the tier mix. So that is a much different animal than the TRS, where there's no tier associated with the pension match, but here there is. So a Tier 1 person costs the district more than a Tier 6 person. So there's a blend going on in addition to the rate. So there's a little bit of math that I kind of worked on to come up with different rates there. The contractual salaries I just talked about, so I used what I could for the contracts I had. And we have seen, some leveling on some of those salaries for the IFA contract, where in the next couple of years, we have a 0.75 plus step. I've kind of see the average being about 1.8 going forward. In the clerical to aides, I didn't really have a model yet, but because, again, you have step and you have an increase, I used about the same 1.8, 1.92, somewhere in that range. Kind of modeled it based on different people. I went out as far as I could. The custodial contract we just settled, so I had those numbers pretty much locked in there, and the IAA contract are locked in there. Health insurance, I used the 4.5 that we are expecting for this coming year, and then 6% for the years going out, which is something I pretty much standard do with a conservative number. You can see some big swings going maybe up to 10, but lately, health insurance has been kind of stable, and Chris might be able to talk to that a little bit.
So as the board knows, the district is in a health insurance consortium that's comprised of 22 school districts in the region. I am the vice president of that group. And we're really proud of the work that we've done over the history of the plan. I can speak to my 4 years experience on the board in that we have beat not only the national market, but also come in with rates that are well below the state plan. The finances for the plan are extremely healthy. So recognizing challenges facing school districts, we're able to apply monies this year from a very healthy reserve account to be able to keep down costs. So when you see that number of 4.5%, that is far below this 7+% national average that we're seeing. So that's really the good work of all the school districts in the region and a number of volunteers. And I would say that the Swiss Chip Group is an ideal example of a labor management relationship where the executive board of volunteers is comprised of all superintendents and business officials. We have a broader board that is comprised of representatives from all major labor groups. And we really work together to maintain high-quality benefits, but to keep costs down for constituent districts. So we're really pleased to see the rate that we're coming forward with this year, and hope that we're able to keep on that trend that we've been on the last 4 years that I can speak to.
Okay, thank you. Under contractual and supplies, I've kind of kept this at 1%. We haven't seen a huge increase in this area, which is good. You think you might want to match it to CPI, but a lot of our vendors are keeping things pretty even. Some will keep same prices as last year. Some will only go up a little bit. It does fluctuate. You have some that make an adjustment for fuel or whatever, but it hasn't been huge, so I haven't been too aggressive with that. BOCES, we've seen numbers, there's a little bit more salary driven, so the costs of BOCES tend to be a little bit more on their staffing. So there I did do a little bit higher increase on that, those related numbers. The BOCES administrative fee, I still have for 1 year going, that 1 year 10% increase that I did last year. I will actually know soon if I was right. I'll know early January on this one, but because they have this retiree health piece that they had to then bring in, and they used to be able to use a reserve. So at some point I'll know whether I was correct on that, and then I'll be able to adjust the plan accordingly. And then I expect it to level off after that. So once I brought it up one number, I leveled it off. Utilities, again, we could have a change here. It's been fairly steady. I've only modeled a 1.5% increase. We've been managing some usage along with increased rates and changes. We haven't seen anything major going on there. Again, those are the kind of situations where a really cold winter could hurt us, but you never really do know. Special ed tuitions, I've kept it about 2%. Again, that's a little bit higher just because it's more salary driven. Transportation, we've been kind of all over the place. 1 year we were up 11.7%. 1 year we were down 0.8%. Another year we were up 8%. So that's one that's hard to model. It depends on the number of students you're transporting to different private schools, to different special ed schools. our own bus routes are more stable, but the rest of the transportation world is not. We saw a huge increase in the athletic field trip piece this year because of the way that new contract was bid out, and apparently we were way under other contracts in the area, so that one was a correction for Royal Coach, but there's not a lot of competition out there, so I kept it at 3, and we have to try to come up with some ways to keep managing that cost, so that's one of them. Capital expense, last year we budgeted, or this year we have a budget of 163.5, which was down a little from the previous budget, and that number has been kind of all over the place over the years. But we've had as high as, one year we had as high as 341,000, and in more recent years we were in the high 100s, like 194, 188. We brought it down a little bit this year because of the capital project, and we're addressing a lot of those bigger needs. So that's not a number that I increased for now. Okay, but something maybe after 4 or 5 years, we might want to start thinking about putting a little bit more back in that number to plan for some of our needs budgetarily and not have to have another big, large borrowing. So it really depends on the needs.
And if I could just make one point, as Carol had mentioned, that one year that appeared to be a bit of an anomaly where we saw funds budgeted in excess of $300,000. That was a year where we had a very generous tax cap, and rather than simply just raising taxes to do so, the board opted to identify some particular projects that it was going to pay for through the operating budget. So money was added in that given year to tackle renovation of student restroom here on the campus, which was well over $100,000.
Okay, and again, debt service we've talked about. I've used our existing schedule, including the new borrowing, and there are some other one-time adjustments, where I know something. I'll give you an example. When we get to revenue, the sales tax is one where I do know now that we're going to be seeing more money coming in. This will be when we finish this first quarter, it'll be the first quarter fully that we will get with the new money coming in. So I'll be able to model that better. It's up pretty decent, so I'm expecting a good 150,000 more, maybe even a little bit more than that. So I'm excited about that for us because that'll give us some opportunities. So that's, where there is known information, I'm putting it in. Okay.
And Cal, just to clarify, that 100 or 50, so that's on an annual basis?
Yeah, but it may even be a little bit higher. So I'm thinking it could be even more. I'm trying to get a sense for what it's going to be right now because we're trying to get a sense of if the percentage we're going to get is the same, how that's changing, how they're divvying that up to the different the municipalities that are getting more increase. But it could be even more. So I'm trying to get a sense for it. So by the time we get to budget, I will have a better handle on that, and I'll know for our 2020 budget process, and then I can update the plan. So that's the kind of thing, too, is once I get some information, I go back and update our plan. So I'm not waiting for a whole year. I just kind of have it ready to go. So the model that I work with then makes an output report like this, and then I can, obviously do different at it, but it basically gives you the revenues, then the expenditures, and then you get a sense of where you are. Do you have a surplus? Do you have a deficit? So if you make a model and you make some assumptions, and then you end up with all deficits, I think you need to start making some new assumptions, like maybe you need to tailor down, you bring down some of your expenses, or you need to think about where am I going to have to trim something, or where could we potentially increase revenue. So this is where this model is good because it'll forecast out for you where you're going to land. So after a lot of my different assumptions came in, I was kind of happy to find out that I didn't really have zeros or negative numbers showing up on this answer. I call this my answer, like the answer. So if I got a lot of zeros or negative numbers, I'd be having to think about what we were assuming. So again, you cannot have a deficit. This is something where you just can't budget for deficits, right? The state would come in and run your school districts. That's not something we ever want to do. So when I looked at this and I saw that when I had the 422.5 going across in all those scenarios, because that transfer is really what we're bringing in from our fund balance, and we have been doing in the past couple of years, and we did bring it down a little bit already in the last couple of years. Our surplus was even a little bit higher, so I thought, okay, this might be a good time to start thinking about bringing it down a little bit more. And I'll talk a little about why we want to do that in a minute, but that's something that I'm recommending as something that we're going to consider. This is just very illustrative. It doesn't mean we have to do this. This doesn't mean anything. I'm bringing it to show you that even when you do that, you'll still be at a surplus environment at this point with these assumptions. It's something you have to look at annually. You cannot like predict 5 years out that you're going to really bring it down, but you want to start to think about the idea of doing that, and that's why I modeled it this way. So I will talk about some of the detail in some of these, and then I'll come back to the strategies. Okay, so let me do it that way.
Just one other question, just for, I think, public clarification.
Sure.
The salary and benefits you are modeling, that's based on the employees we have here today, so.
Right.
As people retire and things change, that number will.
That number changes, it does. Again, so people change, new people come in, sometimes you have some opportunities when that happens. If you have a lot of retirees in 1 year, you may have some opportunities for salaries there when you're bringing in some younger people. Sometimes it's not always an opportunity though, because you may bring in some skilled people, or you may find that, like for example, if it's a physics teacher, you're not necessarily going to be able to bring somebody in at the lowest level on the scale. So depending on where you are and what type of teachers are retiring, it's not always an opportunity. But yes, there's some. And that may give us some opportunity to add some other staff there without having to make a change in terms of the FTE count might be going up, but the cost might not. So that's something we always look at. So the next slide really just is a continuation. I just broke it out so that it was easier to see, because the report puts it all on one page, but I broke it out this year. It just shows it pictorially that, again, your revenues and your expenditures, they have to be close. They have to be fairly equal, so those lines should be hugging each other, that's the way I call it. And then the surplus is just shown on a graph here. So then if we look at the revenue detail, so again, and it's almost like you almost want to start here just to show it pictorially and then go backward, but the revenue is pretty much property tax driven, right? That's the key piece of that. Although I will say that about 4% of that 90% is STAR. So there's a little bit of relief to you guys that some of that is coming back in the form of STAR. So it's about 5-6% is property tax. That is you're paying. The rest is, state aid and other revenues. And I'll talk a little about those. So you can see where our projections are going up, and now I'll kind of go back to the detail. So in the other local revenue, you have things like the sales tax revenue. We have tuition revenues. We're seeing a little bit of a decline in that. We had some tuition-paying students. Sometimes we attract within a special ed program some tuition-paying students from other districts. We're continuing to, make that an effort, but sometimes that ebbs and flows based on student needs and who's available to come. More districts are creating their own in-house programs, so they're trying to keep their children in their least restrictive environment, which does make sense. So that sometimes means you aren't able to fill seats that you may have. We've had sometimes we get these one-time refunds of prior year monies owed, so there's some adjustments that played into there. And again, as I see a big increase in the sales tax, probably maybe 150,000, maybe even more, up to 200,000 in the.
Just to circle back one more time, the 150 is based on the first year. Do you expect it to be larger?
Well, once it levels off, I won't expect it to go up that much more. So I made a one-time adjustment for going into 2021, and then that will level off with just more of like a CPI increase going forward.
So your figure is more conservative than what the county was.
Well, I'm taking it all in a 1 year approach. So it's half a year and half a year this year, and so we're going to see some of it this year, and then the rest we'll see the full amount next year. So we're going to be over our forecast for this year, which is good, and then I'll be able to forecast for 2021 a much better number when I'll have the information for sure now, what's actually occurring. But it is positive news on that end, so that is a benefit to the district. Then you get down into your state aid. So your basic aid is your formula aid. They call that your formula aid or your foundation aid. But in that basic aid is also your building aid and your transportation aid, because they consider that all kind of formula aid. And then in the other state revenue, you've got your textbook and aids that are based on student counts. And then you have your excess cost aid, which is based on your special ed population where they're over a certain threshold. And then you also have in that number your BOCES aid. The BOCES aid I have been taking up a little bit because I said before we're utilizing BOCES to the extent we can so that we can maximize that number. So that number has been going up. Excess cost aid, I have it going down in a couple places because we also had we have some students who are in a residential placement. When that occurs, we basically have to only pay the basic foundation aid for that student, and we get everything else back for that. So it's an in and out. But that number is going down because some of those students are going to age out at a certain point. So I kind of even know when these students are aging out, and I put that in the plan. So again, where you know information, you can put it in. Where you don't, you don't. So that's really the state aid piece. I haven't been projecting a huge amount, but it's been steady, and a lot we'll see based on this cycle. This is going to be an interesting state aid cycle because, of course, everybody's wanting more foundation aid, wanting the formula to run. At the same time, the state is talking about having a Medicaid issue and having to cover for that. So we're going to see where they're going to land on this one. But I'm sure you're all watching that and getting the information from the New York School Boards Association as well. So.
So I don't know that, I haven't had a chance to see anything from the school boards, but I saw something that the Medicaid issue is not that, it's more of a, because there's the state expense cap, and so there's the possibility of, if they were willing to go over that cap, that that would be one manner of addressing the gap this year.
Right. So it's something we're going to watch closely then, and as I get more information, I'll keep updating you on as we go through the budget process, especially when we do our budget landscape, and if I have anything more. We typically get the governor's run in toward the end of January, and then we can go from there. A lot of districts will start budgeting really early, and I always find that detrimental because then you're starting to panic and getting information where it's too early. Get some of the numbers and then you can plan. I mean, we do a lot of the prep work now, but like the needs assessments, but the actual putting it all together has to wait. Okay, so I already did this one. So now the expenditure detail, it's the same thing. Obviously, I almost like the picture better to start. You can see again, salaries and benefits are our biggest component, which is what it should be. We're in a people business, so we're paying for our people to work here. The Forecast 5 model that I use put some things weird with capital outlay and equipment. It's a little bit different because some of our capital isn't actually in contractual line, so it's a little bit weird. I almost have to have it remapped for us, but so it's a little bit hard to look at that. But debt service, obviously, and that other pieces are not that much of the pie. It's really all people. So when you go back to it and you take a look on a number basis, you're seeing where those numbers are, and this is just giving you that actual detail. On a percentage basis, it's coming up with some numbers, 2.93, 2.3, 2.37. I looked at, some of our previous numbers, and that's in line. Like last year, we were at 2.83% increase, and the year before about 1.9. So again, it's not out of whack in terms of where we land. So those are the kinds of things I do to say, okay, is this realistic? Because, you put a lot of numbers in a model, and then you want to make sure that the outcome is realistic. And I think it is. It might even be, hopefully it's somewhat conservative still, is my plan. So that's where we're at with the expenditures.
And the one thing that I just think I want to draw out when we take a look at those out years in 23, 24, 24, 25, I think some of the things that we speak to there, not only do we see some decrease in debt service, but I think we also have to be mindful that we're looking at responsible contracts that were negotiated and being able to contain the expenses associated with our employees. So we have to remind ourselves of that, the work that we've done on the board side.
That's true. And the other thing, too, is the only other risk I see here is that if we do have to borrow for tax certs, that could be something that would raise the principal and debt interest. I have not put that in as a risk. So there's some risks here on that one. There's always risks to things. But we'll talk about that a little bit. So that's not included in here. So, again, why do you do the long-range planning? Certain things that you want to have in form when we're talking about when would be a good time to do our capital project. We wanted to look at when is our debt coming off. So this is obviously something, you can just do your debt schedule, but it's good to put it all together. So one of the things you do is you time your capital projects when your debt is reduced, so that you're not asking the voters to increase any more taxes for that reason. Anytime you have any larger one-time expenses or even revenues, I could have almost written here, that might create some opportunities for you. if things are going away that you know about or things that are coming on. So it could also create some issues. I kind of wrote it in a positive way, but it also could be a negative way if you know something like that. And then, part of what that I'm trying to work on for the district, for us, is really as a way to build some of our reserves so that when we have some of these swings, we can offset those swings with those reserves so that we're not affecting our instructional program. So again, Chris talked about having the TRS reserve. If I'm wrong and the pension match goes up to 12 or 13, well, people think, oh, that's not that much. That's a whole lot on a budget. So having a reserve will help you say, okay, but we can take some of the money for the reserve that year to put it in, and that will offset that swing. Similarly, if you have a tax reserve that can handle at least the ongoing payments for every year, you still kind of try to keep it going. At some point, yeah, we're not going to be able to do it, but if we have some big properties, but it helps you. The workers' comp, we've now into a situation where we're more stable with our workers' comp going forward. We still have some claims we have to deal with. So that's, an area I'm always looking at. And then finally, we've set up that capital reserve. So these are the types of reserves that we want to put some money into each year if we can, so that we can offset our program. But how do you really do that? How do you do that? So when you talk about how do you add money to reserves, at the end of each year, you look at what surplus you created. So you have your budget, your revenue minus your expenses creates a surplus. And while you really don't budget for a surplus, you technically do a little because you can't budget for a deficit. So you always have to have some cushion in a budget for a bad winter, or for a special ed students that may move in, or for some staff issues that you might have. So you always have to have some room in your budget to do that. So at the end of the year, you should have some surplus, which then goes into your reserves. Now, we also have our 4%, undesignated. So that number is out there. Of that number, we were always taking a certain amount and putting it into the budget each year. So I'm going back to this slide here for a second. So this is where that 350, that 422.5 come in. So if you're able to increase your surplus just a little bit, then you can make sure that you're adding some money to reserves and less to this. And that's really the strategy. So if I can take a little bit of less, because remember, at the end of my surplus, let's just, for sake of argument, say I have a $60 million budget and I spend only $58 million. I create a surplus of $2 million. I know of that $2 million, 422 has to go back into that because we budgeted for it the next year. Okay, now we've never had a $2 million surplus. That was really wishful thinking. But, if you had such a situation, then the remaining amount can go into your reserves. The money always goes back into our fiscal health. Generally, we haven't had such numbers that we could put that much back into our reserves. So, you don't want to budget for $2 million surplus. That's a little bit silly. But the point is that if you do have some surplus, you're able to lessen the amount that has to go back in as a revenue source and use the rest of it to increase some of those reserves.
So can we stick with that one for a little while, though, or briefly? So in 422.5 had been the figure that had been for a number of years, and then we had some really low tax cap numbers and wanted to make sure we could fit some pieces in, so we increased that number for a period of time, and now we're back to 422.5, and you're recommending that we start to decrease that. And if I understand correctly, it's because the idea is that we hope to not be reliant on that. And
yeah, it's kind of a tough concept because you basically, whatever surplus you generate, let's just say we had a year where we had to spend just about our entire budget, okay, and we ended with no surplus. Technically, then we would have a loss for that year because the year going forward, we'd have to spend 422.5 of our undesignated reserve in order to fund the balance if we've designated that much to go into the next year's budget. So we'd be starting with a deficit. And so that's why, it's a lot of districts do this because they've built up too big a reserve. We don't have that situation. We're barely always making that 4%. So we're looking at always making that 4% and then hopefully getting a little bit extra to put into some of our other reserves. If you don't, if you always plan to put money back into the budget, you're never able to get out of that situation. So it is a little bit of an interesting concept. I mean, I would love to see zero there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess this is a pretty, it's a, well, some somewhat significant shift. And I don't want it to take over this conversation, but it would be great to have more.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where you kind of have to, I hate to say it, play it by ear, but you do have to play it by ear, because you have to see where where the tax cap's going to be, because I'm going to show you something in a minute, and you'll see that it would go out the window, right? So if I go into another scenario, which I created just for this purpose, a very pessimistic view, okay, so here's my pessimistic view. So now I lowered the CPI to 1, okay? So we're, now we've seen lower than 1, okay? But we've also, obviously, last 2 years have been at 2. But if you do that, all of a sudden, and notice I have to put that 422.5 back in there, and I'm still at a deficit position. So, and I didn't change anything else, okay? Now, I don't think that that's a realistic scenario right now, given the way the world is working, but it could happen. And even if we do have that, we would then be looking at our expenses more carefully. Some other things would probably change. Maybe some other revenues would change. There's so many variables, so I really don't want to focus on it, but I just want to, say that this is the kind of thing where from year to year, you need to be looking at where you're at. And again, pensions could be going up, could be going down. Pensions, it's one of those things. But basically, the bottom line is that if you're looking at this from a strategic point of view, you can get some sense about where you really want to be, what strategies you want to start to use to make sure we're ensuring the fiscal health. Because really, the goal is to keep the educational program solid, not having to make cuts every year. I mean, I remember, 5-6 years ago, everybody was looking to make cuts. Where can we cut? And you want to try to keep your program solid so that you're not having to do that. So reserves are helpful for that. I mean, there are some people that argue that you should never have reserves and that money should always go back to the taxpayers by lowering the budget. The problem is in the public sector, it's not like, private sector where you have to have some balances in order to be able to manage your money and keep some stability in your financial plan. That's part of what the long-range plan does, and that's kind of why I like this opportunity to explain some of these concepts to you, so as we're budgeting, you understand those concepts, because ultimately that's the decision from the board. And that's really where I'm at.
Thank you. Anyone have any questions at this point?
Go ahead.
I just wanted to circle back to, I guess it's on slide 8, if it's still the same slide, around the capital spending.
Mm-hmm.
And slide 8.
The assumptions.
The assumption slide.
Assumptions, yeah.
So we've fluctuated on the capital you're talking about, Michael?
Right, so, I mean, I guess the idea is the next couple, 2 years-ish, we're spending a lot of money around the capital projects. But it continues, because I also separately, have a 9-acre property that I'm on the board of. It seems difficult for me to believe that we are only spending $165,000 in a typical year outside of those capital projects.
Okay, so that there's kind of more money in there. That's really just that we have a number called capital projects that are really more one-time projects, and then we have more of a maintenance budget, which is also about $200,000. So between the two, we're spending probably more like $400,000. We have a whole maintenance line. So like summer maintenance projects that you get that detailed sheet on, where we're painting the hallways and we're doing, recoating flooring. That is done every year. So that's more of a standard maintenance number. It's also project-based. So when we present the budget, we will be showing you the list of things again in that number. The capital one was more like the window well project at Main Street, where that's one large expense of like, say, $50,000, $60,000 in one shot. That's what that 163 is, 163.5. Those are where we're replacing the TG doors this year because they're all rusted, can't barely close. So those are those one bigger things. There's usually only 3 or 4 projects in that number. The other one has 20 projects. So no, we are spending a whole lot more on maintenance than just that. It's just how I differentiated between that.
And I know the district has gone a long ways towards creating cycles for, around the maintenance. And we have an outside vendor that comes and does an assessment of what our needs are.
So, yes, we do. So, every year, of course, not every year, every couple of years, you do what's called the building condition survey. We'll be doing that this coming year now, actually starting at any time in the year, calendar year 2020. The state, in their wisdom, decided to make this a calendar year thing and not a fiscal year thing, just to kind of play with our minds here. But ours is due in 2020 sometime. We'll probably do it in the beginning of 2020 because we also want to make sure that everything that we're spending for our capital project is aligned with our plan. That will let the architect guide us on that one. I'm not 100% sure, but we'll let the architect guide us. So if things are noted in our building condition survey, then we're obviously allowed to do projects for them. And then we just determine what things we can do on our own in an operational budget and what are just too large for the capital budget.
Right.
You know, if it's some small things, you can definitely budget for them. We also are establishing that capital reserve, so as we have a chance to do that. The only difference there is that has to be voter approved in order to spend the money. Additionally, even though, we've put the money aside.
All right, so, I mean, I guess essentially coming out of this next 2-year cycle, that would be maybe something we could take another look at.
Mhm.
Right. All right. I mean, I have more questions, but, you want to do that?
I just have one, I think it's probably an easy question. When I looked at the assumptions and we were looking at health insurance going up 4.5% for 2021 and pension going up 8.86 and ERS 14, I'm just curious on page 13 where we're showing the benefit increase, and this is probably just me not being able to do the math quickly, it's going up, it's the biggest increase is from 1920 to 2021, but that's when we have our smallest increase in health insurance and smallest increase in the pension rate. What else is driving that?
So there's a workers' comp piece. I probably put an adjustment of workers' comp. In fact, I think I put a one-time adjustment in there.
That makes sense. I figured
Because
it
that's
was-
been something that's been plaguing us. We were budgeting way too low in that area, so I've been stepping that up every year. I think there might have been one other adjustment I made for the welfare fund based on the contracts that we negotiated. We upped that in some of the contracts, so I added some money there. So again, where I'm looking at knowing the information, I've added that level of detail.
That makes sense. Thanks, Carol. This was awesome, by the way. I know a lot of work goes into this.
Yes.
Mhm. So that's a good question. Thank you, Erin.
No.
I should have pointed that out.
No, that's I'm probably the only one noticing that stuff.
Kudos.
No, it's my class. God bless the rest of you that.
Just say that I appreciate the presentation and that I appreciate the description of the tax cert issue because there are some people in the community who aren't aware of that, so thank you.
Yeah, the tax cert issue is a tough one because, if you could settle them in a more current year, then that assessment gets reassessed to everybody, but when you have to go back and pay, that's where it gets tough. You can't go back and reassess everybody and pay their levy differently. So, that's where the challenge lies. So you already know that.
Fourth time round. Gets better every year.
Mhm. Yeah, they're getting quicker now. I think they are. They're getting more timely, which will be helpful going forward.
I always appreciate your clear.
Yeah.
Right, well, this is something we used to not have, so this is a great addition.
It is great.
On the slide 9, in terms of where you look at the change, in terms of what we set aside, you have a number in terms of the revenue, the surplus deficit number, and it looks like, I guess, that surplus deficit, that's not relevant. I don't think, there's money we set aside for reserves, and we use the surplus for that. Is this number the same number that we're looking at when we talk about what we're setting aside for reserves?
So, the conversation for setting money aside for reserves only happens, toward the last part of the year when we know what we are going to actually generate in the surplus. We don't really budget to put money in reserves.
That's right.
You could budget in your budget for capital. I believe you can actually put a line in that says transfer to capital. So if we really wanted to, let's say, put in our budget, like say we had, again, Chris mentioned putting it in the actual budget, that we increased that 1 year where we had that large $300,000. You could actually put a line in, transfer to the H fund capital for capital projects. Like, you can do that and put that in the reserves. Other than that, you really can't budget for reserves. You could increase your budget to pay more tax certs out of the budget versus a reserve. So that would be another place if you had a better levy. But you really just can't say, oh, I'm going to budget and put money into reserves. You really budget for your operating expenses, correct? So this strategy shows you, again, even when I do this and show an illustrative 350 versus the 422, if I had tried to put a higher number in 2021 and 2022, it wouldn't have worked, because by 2023 we would have been in a negative situation. So that's why I only used the 350, because I want to try to keep a level number in this scenario. But then, since I had surplus going out the following 2 more years, I could go down to 300 and 250. So I'm just kind of showing you that as an illustrative point. If you go down too much in the previous years, then I would have been negative. It's tough when you look at this because it's so far out and it's hard to know. It's really hard to know. But the point is to show that I can't just pick a number now and say, oh, this is a good year, let me go down 300, because I might have to go back up again, and you don't really want to make these swings, right? That's where I want to be more conservative and not recommend something that we can't sustain.
Right. And that's always the key question on the fund balance, and I subscribe to what you're saying in terms of budgeting. But I guess what I'm trying to understand is that an indication of where we would stand in terms of, obviously it'll be some number different than that, but will 2 years and 3 years out be a situation in which we may have, under that scenario, we would have more trouble funding reserves? Is that what that's
Well,
suggesting?
let's just say this was our budget, okay, for the next 2 years. Let's just say this is where we ended up, and this is our budget. And everything exactly happened according to this. So at the end of next year, we would only have to put 350,000 in. We would still have 62,000. Maybe we could put in some other reserves. Again, it won't happen exactly like this, but something like that would happen. It's just basically to show that we'd still we would still be in a positive situation.
I'll try again some other day. I don't think I'm able to make my question clear. I don't know if anybody else has another.
Just one other question, Carol. Is there additional true-ups in the contractual supplies and other line? Because that's going up 2.5%, but the rest of the time it's going up like 1.9, 1.8, So is there something else
So
in there?
that's the line that has like a bunch of different things in it, and
Right.
it's, there's BOCES, and that also includes BOCES. This is the expenditure side, right?
Slide 13.
Yeah, so the contractual supplies and others includes BOCES, which I have different assumptions in. I have 3% in that. I have that one-time expense in there for the BOCES administrative costs in there.
Yeah.
There's a couple other numbers running around. So that's higher in that first year, and then it kind of starts to level off because of that. And as I said, I'll know that shortly, what that number's going to be.
Yeah.
It might be lower. I mean, I might have been way aggressive on that one number, but there's certain ones I just don't want to. I want to be conservative, so I don't tell the world we're going to have all this money, and then you guys, what happened to that money you said we were going to have? So, and then you're like looking at me like, whoa.
Yeah, no, manage expectations. I'm
Yeah, a
all
little
for-
bit.
That's.
Anyone else? Thank you very much again, a very informative presentation, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's great.
Now we're on to 7.1, which is the consent agenda. Any questions on it before we move forward on that? Can I get a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
So I think as reflected in our agenda, our next meeting is January 14th at 7:30. And can I get a motion to adjourn our public session for executive session to discuss, matters pertaining to the employment history of particular persons and collective bargaining?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Two important points of business then as we head out. I know it's just you coming in.